Hello and welcome to the Phuket Stories podcast. I'm your moderator, Saigon Steve. On this recorded podcast, we'll talk with service alumni who were stationed at Phuket Air Force Base in Vietnam and talk with them about their experiences. Today's podcast is pre-recorded, but you're invited to participate on future podcasts by emailing your contact information to PhuketStories@gmail.com. That's PhuketStories@gmail.com. So let's get started with today's Phuket guest. We're talking with Jan Scruggs. Jan Scruggs did not go to Phuket Air Force Base, but he was in the United States Army in Vietnam. People who went to Vietnam probably recognize the name Jan Scruggs. Why? Because he founded the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. And we're going to talk to Jan now about his time in the Army, in Vietnam, and thereafter. Hi, Jan.
Hello.
Jan, when did you join the Army?
I volunteered to be drafted right out of high school. So in August of 1968, I had my father drop me off in Baltimore, Maryland, took a bus down to beautiful Fort Bragg, North Carolina for training.
They call it in the Army the MOS, I guess? We call it in the Air Force AFSC. What was your training for?
The MOS is a military occupational specialty, and I was trained in infantry and a indirect fire crewman. Primarily what I did over there in Vietnam was shoot an 81 millimeter mortar at various targets that we were told to shoot at.
So tell me, what year did you go to Vietnam?
I arrived there in April of 1969 and got back in April of 1970. So I did 12 months in Vietnam.
What was your thinking when you got your orders to go to Vietnam?
Well, I thought it was pretty much inevitable, so there was no shock there. And I was kind of, ready for this adventure of going to war, like John Wayne and all these people went to World War II. Now it was my turn. So I was, motivated to go there. And I didn't really like it much in Vietnam. I found it was a very dangerous place. It was very easy to get yourself seriously hurt or killed. And I was in my first actual battle on May 27th of 1969. And I fired about 50 rounds out of my M16 rifle. And I was changing magazines when the enemy team got behind us with a rocket-propelled grenade and fired it, and I was hit very severely. But right before this happened, the morning before I got hit, I figured I was probably going to get shot that day since everyone seemed to be getting shot. So I took my Army poncho and I literally put it behind my rear end, thinking that it would stop some of the shrapnel or perhaps even a bullet. And it actually did. I was actually hit right there in the rump, the Forrest Gump wound, I believe they call it, and which is a great place to get wounded because there's no internal organs in your buttocks. But the Army poncho stopped a piece of shrapnel about the size of a golf ball. I think that probably would have split my spine or something awful. But anyway, they gave me some morphine. They were shooting at these guys trying to rescue me. But somehow or another, everybody stopped shooting. I got out of the field and spent a couple of months at a hospital in Vietnam.
Well, you're in good company getting shot in the rear. I believe Lee Marvin was shot in the rear and Audie Murphy was shot in the rear. So must be a big target.
Yeah, well, that's...
But you didn't know that, did you?
Could have been a lot worse. Could have been a lot worse. I did not know that. Yeah. So I'm in good company. That's fantastic.
Yes, you're in good company being shot in the rear.
Yeah.
So you got the Purple Heart. For being shot?
Yes. Yes.
And what happens when you get the Purple Heart? Do they come to your hospital bed like they did in the movie Patton and give you the Purple Heart, or how does that work?
I was in the hospital, and this officer showed up. He was an Army first lieutenant, I believe. And he says, Private Scruggs, on behalf of the Secretary of the Army, Stanley Resor, and the Department of the Army, I am proud to give you the Purple Heart for your wounds received in action. And you should be proud. We're proud of you, young man. So a little bit of drama associated with it, but he had a big stack of them he was giving out that day. So everybody got about 2 minutes of time.
And do they pin it on you just like they did in the movie?
No, they handed it to me. I think it seemed like there were a couple of guys who kind of wanted it pinned on. I just wanted the Purple Heart, and I didn't really want to bother the guy.
So what hospital were you in Vietnam?
Well, I think this started out, I think it was the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, which was near Saigon. And from there, I was sent to an Air Force hospital for a week, which was unbelievable. Beautiful air conditioning, good food, everything's great. And then they sent me to Cam Ranh Bay at a special convalescent center hospital. And we didn't have any air conditioning or anything. And I said, man, this is not the Air Force hospital that I enjoyed so much. So I stayed there for, I think, 6 weeks, and then I was recovered enough to go back to my unit.
So is it like an open bay thing with all the troops around you wounded, or do you have your own room? How does it work in a military hospital like that?
Well, in a military hospital, yeah, you can get your own room, but by and large, there were about 25 of us spread out there. You can look across and see the other people who were much more severely wounded than you. You could see guys who, woke up one morning feeling great, and next thing you know, 4 hours later, they just lost their leg, and they're looking at this little stump down there, scratching their head. So it's overall a very unpleasant experience, and that's war. That's war. It doesn't really make it in these TV movies you see, but it's pretty ugly stuff. And we were fighting a very determined enemy, and I know you had an opportunity to see that they felt they had mortars, they had weapons, and it was their job to make life miserable for the Americans, because eventually we would get tired of it, and the support in Congress and among the public would erode. And that's basically what happened, and it came to a very tragic end, of course.
So you spent 3 months in the hospital, and then you returned to combat duty, and once again, you were in a firefight. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I got in a firefight. It was in the year of November 1969. We were moving towards what appeared to be a North Vietnamese bunker complex, because we had found some equipment that had been laying on the ground. So we were sort of right behind them, and we walked into this bunker complex, but they were very well hidden. They had a bunch of guys with rifles, and they were just kind of taking pot shots at us. And I had this rifle called a recoilless rifle, 90 millimeter recoilless rifle, and they asked me to go up to the front to knock out this bunker with it. So I said, okay. I ran up to the front, put the sight on the bunker, and I pulled the trigger, and it wouldn't work. I couldn't believe it. So I put another round in, recocked it, did everything right, pulled the trigger, and it wouldn't work. So I said, well, so much for that. So I had a shotgun, so I shot at the bunker with my shotgun. And then finally I said, look, there's got to be a way to end this firefight after 4 hours. So what I did was, when they fired fully automatic rounds at us, I took my shotgun and shot it straight up in the air, so all the pellets would kind of drop on the captain and the lieutenant area. They were mismanaging this battle. So they thought the rounds were getting closer to them, so they called for us to retreat. So I saved lives that day. And then as I was retreating, they said, well, make sure Scruggs gets that gun back. a recoilless rifle. So I said, okay, let me get the recoilless rifle. And the captain said, and we'll make sure he gets an award for gallantry for saving this piece of military equipment. And that was that. So I was decorated for gallantry for saving a malfunctioning gun. And of course, when they got it back to the Army base, it worked absolutely perfectly. So that was just kind of a strange day. And the most dramatic thing that happened to me, there were several dramatic things that happened to all of us, but it was January of 1970. Charlie Company mortars were returning from an operation, and they were unloading the truck full of mortar shells, and all of a sudden the mortar shells exploded. And there were 12 guys there, and I knew them. We used to play softball, all that sort of thing, and they're on fire. Their arms, legs, brains, everything. They all died. None of them survived. And one guy was walking past us, and he was killed too. We couldn't find any wounds on him, but he was dead. So I went into a pretty deep funk after that, and I had really post-traumatic stress disorder. Nobody really had a name for it at the time, but I finished my military service. I went home, bought a motorcycle, got a job. I was very haunted by all of this drama in my life. So I hitchhiked around, drove my motorcycle around, made a fool of myself for a while, but finally I went to American University and started studying what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. And I became a recognized expert on what is now called post-traumatic stress. And flowing from that, I graduated from college with a master's degree in 1977. But flowing from that was the idea for this national memorial, a national memorial filled with the names of the fallen. And this was a theory based upon the writings of an Austrian psychiatrist named Carl Jung, Jung. And he believes that there are collective psychological states and that there's this symbolism that is really important that holds societies together. And one of those symbols is the warrior who returns, or the warrior who gives his life for the country, far away from home. He's very much venerated. So I took this theory of his and decided that we need to have the names on the memorial, and started in 1979. My chance of success was 0.0. Had a press conference. I was very determined to make this thing work, but it was going nowhere. And then in July 4th of 1979, the CBS Evening News did a story in which they said a guy named Jan Scruggs is trying to build a National Vietnam Veterans Memorial and has thus far raised $144.50. So that was what I needed. Because of that, I got a team of very skilled people. This was particularly a lot of effort and was put into this by a guy named John P. Wheeler. John P. Wheeler was a graduate of West Point, a graduate of Harvard Business School, graduate of Yale Law School, very brilliant man. He recently got a lot of publicity. He was actually murdered in the year 2010. No one knows how this happened, but to go to Netflix and look for Washington Insider murder, it was just aired.
And Jan, I'd like to back up just a little bit because we're getting a little bit ahead of the story here. So let's just back up just a moment. And I want to say to the people listening, Jan is not a braggart. He didn't tell us, but it's here on paper. He received 3 Army Commendation Medals as well as the Medal for Valor. He won't tell you that, but it's there on his record. Heck of a guy. Now, Jan, it says here that what motivated you was going to the movie in 1979, the movie The Deer Hunter. And that's when it started to formulate in your mind. Is that right?
Yes, Indeed. Yes and no, really. I had the idea earlier, and I went to see this movie Deer Hunter with my wife and a couple of her friends. And I went back home that night, and I said, this memorial idea, which I had earlier, I said, I'm going to do this. So I went to see my boss at the Department of Labor. I was a GS7 at the time. And I said, I'm going to build a national memorial in the center of Washington, D.C. I have to do this. And he said, Scruggs, we all need a mental health day from time to time, but maybe we want to take a couple of weeks. So I said, thanks a lot, because I need to work this thing out. So I put together the plan, none of which worked. But yes, the movie motivated me, but it was really my academic training and interest in PTSD that provided the theoretical basis for what became a successful monument.
So before the movie, were you having nightmares, PTSD nightmares, or was it after the movie that set it off?
No, I always had nightmares with some frequency. But for me, the PTSD was just kind of, I was self-medicating with, alcohol and maybe smoking a little too much pot. Entered my dreams from time to time. But ultimately, look, I had to get this done. It was like Dan Aykroyd in this movie. He says, look, we're on a mission from God. And to me, I was on a mission from God. I mean, this is what I had to do. I'm not a church-going person, but this was just something, there was a spiritual element in this, and I had to do this. This was my role. This was why I made it through Vietnam. I don't know, but I had to do this and started it, and we got the right team together, fought a lot of battles, and ultimately we won.
Well, this is almost like the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington with Jimmy Stewart. You're one guy against the whole system with this idea, and they look at you and say, you're crazy, right?
Well, initially, yes, but once we got some impressive people involved, partners in big law firms, a couple of U.S. senators stood behind us and said, this is a good idea. A guy named Senator Charles Mathias of Maryland, John Warner of Virginia. This is back in 1979. And they said, look, we're going to need legislation to get this thing through. So I learned how Capitol Hill worked and how you get co-sponsors. And ultimately, we were able to get 100 people co-sponsoring this legislation, which is pretty much extraordinary.
And this was in 1979. They were still out there, not in the streets, but they were out there. A lot of people against the Vietnam War didn't want to hear about it. And they were very negative about this. Is that correct?
Well, we found we got a lot of people involved here. One was Barry Goldwater, the other one was George McGovern, who sort of carried the mantle for the anti-war people. So we said, look, this is not about the Vietnam War. This is about the service of the veterans. So we are going to separate the war from the warrior. And that became our mantra. And once we started doing that, ideologically, we never had any problems from the left. But ultimately, the design that was selected created massive problems with us from people on the far right.
Well, I want our listeners to know that Jan wrote a book called To Heal a Nation. And they also made a made-for-TV movie starring Eric Roberts and Glennis O'Connor as his wife, Becky. And this is all in the film. And if you watch, and I would like you people to go onto YouTube and go into the search and type in To Heal a Nation, you can watch this movie. It is just unbelievable. I watched it last night, and it's just an emotional trip. And Jan was like David and Goliath in this movie. Everything was against him, and he prevailed. It's just an amazing, amazing story. You brought up about the design of the Vietnam Wall. Tell us about what that was all about. You had a contest. Was there a money award for the contest, or was it just people putting in their architectural ideas? How did that work?
No, this was an architectural design competition. It has to be very carefully administered. And this was the largest architectural design competition held in the history of Western civilization. Over 1,400 teams of people entered the competition. And the competition said, look, we want this memorial to be reflective and contemplative and to blend in with the surroundings. So a young lady named Maya Lin of Athens, Ohio, who was at Yale University at the time, had this idea for a memorial made of black granite, which is very reflective. You can see it's like a mirror-like surface. And she was a very interesting person, very dynamic person, but the design became extraordinarily controversial.
What I saw in the movie, they cross-examined her and they said, shouldn't the names be in alphabetical order? And she said, this is not a telephone directory. They were put up in the date that they were killed in Vietnam, which is much more poignant than putting people in alphabetical order.
40 people named John Smith were killed in Vietnam. I mean, how would you know which one was your John Smith? But so the names are in order based upon when the death occurred. So, and the page, it goes like pages in a book, panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, and it starts on the other side, and the beginning and the end meet in the center of the memorial. And it's kind of like the concept of yin and yang. It's a good thing. It's extremely popular. 5.5 million people come to see it every year. It has been described by people as a little bit like the Western Wall in Jerusalem, or a little bit like Mecca. People who, the Muslim faith, they all have to go to Mecca. I mean, for people who are in Vietnam, they all have to go see the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And so it's a beautiful thing, and a great work of architecture that has done a lot to help heal some wounds for the country, certainly for the veterans and family members of the fallen and all those who served.
And there was a big controversy. They wanted statues and flags flying, and your concept was this memorial. Isn't that correct?
Our concept was, look, we had a design competition. This woman won it. It has the names on it. We can certainly add a flagpole, but the opponents said we want it white, we want it above ground, we want a flagpole in the center and a big statue in front of it. And that was not a good idea. We couldn't go that far. So they fought us. They tried to stop the construction permit from being issued. These are very substantial people in Washington with access to the White House. And this came in front of the National Security Council, the Reagan administration, and this was a very big deal. We were outnumbered, but we were not outsmarted. So we fought back. We fought back in the media. We fought back on shows like 60 Minutes and Nightline. I got out in front. I would debate people on this design, and ultimately we won because of the support we had from the veterans of foreign wars and the American Legion, mainstream veterans groups like that, and political support. We had many prominent Americans and football players and so forth and so on. So it was a terrible battle. It all ended in 1982, and we had this beautiful dedication ceremony. Everybody, 50,000 people were there. The memorial was on the map. But these people who tried to stop it, these are very mean-spirited people. In 1983, they went after us again, claiming that we had, illegally raised money, and where did all the money go? And this was like a 4-part series of a TV show. And we finally got the reporter fired and won that battle. And then in 1993, right after the 10th anniversary of the memorial, Peter Jennings went after me and the Vietnam Memorial Fund, claiming that we were asking the public for money to maintain the memorial, but in fact that was done by the National Park Service. It was the same group of clowns who were behind this whole thing, including the reporter who got fired. So it's been a very unpleasant experience for me. I've been under attack so many times by people who are very good at what they do. And I'm now retired. I'm in Annapolis, and life is good. Life is very good for me. But I have been through some very difficult stuff.
We're going to talk about that, too. Getting back to the wall, Jan, all of the memorials in Washington, D.C., are they normally funded by the United States government, where yours didn't start that way? They fought you all the way. Isn't that correct?
Well, the Marine Corps Memorial, also known as the Iwo Jima Memorial, was built with private contributions. The Lincoln Memorial, of course, and Washington Monument were built by the government. But when you walk around the White House, there's a memorial to the 1st Infantry Division behind the White House on Constitution Avenue. That is from the people who started the 1st Infantry Division. So many of the monuments you see, and there's another one called the Tennessee Volunteer Memorial. So in order to get a memorial built in Washington after the Civil War, you had to fight for the winning side. So this was the Union veterans of the Army of Tennessee, and that's near the White House grounds off 17th Street. So yes, many of the monuments are built by veterans associations, and that's the case. I'm now involved. I'm helping these people. I started the Global War and Terror Memorial for the people serving in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So that's a fantastic thing.
Now, when you got the private donations, it says that you raised $8 million from private donors. Was there any more monies chipped in from the government, or was that it, just the private donors?
No, I mean, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was not expensive. I mean, they just dedicated the Eisenhower Memorial. It's like $150 million. I mean, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the granite, the excavation, the irrigation, everything that we put into this whole thing, the whole price tag, including the statue, was $4.5 million. So we, and I had an office, I had a staff, we had fundraising expenses. So raising money for this Vietnam Veterans Memorial was not difficult. It was not about money. It was about the people who felt that this memorial, because it was black instead of white, was making a political statement on the Vietnam War. 40 members of Congress wrote to the Secretary of the Interior, said, please immediately stop all plans for construction of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Do not issue a construction permit. This project needs to be reevaluated. So Congress had spoken. We had to make a compromise with these people. And we said, look, here's our compromise. After hours of, screaming and yelling at each other, so the compromise here is we will add a traditional element to this non-traditional memorial. Traditional element is the statue. We ended up selecting a fellow named Frederick Hart, who was a very famous sculptor at the time, the most famous in America. And he did the frieze at the National Cathedral, for example. And he came up with the design of the Three Servicemen statue, which was dedicated in 1984. So we broke ground in March of 1982. The opponents tried to stop us from breaking ground, and we outmaneuvered them with a little bit of luck from a West Point graduate that's bullied the Secretary of the Interior into giving the construction permit to us. And anyway, it's a nice little TV movie. It's free. It's on YouTube. Yeah, To Heal a Nation, and it's fairly entertaining. I would encourage everyone to see it. And I would also like to note that I'm on the phone with Saigon Steve, and I think he's gotten me talked into starting my own podcast, Jan Scruggs and Saigon Steve podcast, with some of the preeminent figures and historians about the Vietnam War, to talk about the experience of the soldiers as well as the overall bigger questions of the war itself, and what did we learn, and what good came out of it, as well as what good and bad came out of it. Very expensive.
Well, I am looking forward to doing that podcast with you, Jan. You started with an idea back then. We have an idea today. I think we have good karma on this.
Yes, it's going to happen.
I want to end the interview with some lines from the movie, because this is what really got me. It's a very emotional movie. I know people here in Washington that go down to the wall, and they weren't even in the military, and they get emotional. I know people in Washington that were in the military and will not go near the wall. They can't take the emotional strain of it. I went down to the wall, and I was in the Air Force, right? I was not out into the real jungle every day with an M16 like you see in the movie Platoon. And it affected me emotionally. So the wall is just an unbelievable thing. Jan, you have outdone everything against the people that were against it, but you've come out in the end, and your name will be out there like Christopher Columbus discovered America. Well, Jan Scruggs came up with the idea for the Vietnam Wall.
Yeah,
I believe that. Now, in this movie, there's some lines I wanted to tell the people. There's a scene where this woman looks up at the wall and she puts her hand up against the name and she says,
"That's my son Sam."
Oh my goodness.
and that's when I lost it. In I was watching the movie, it's emotional, but when she did that, I just lost it. And then there's in the movie where this veteran comes up to you and he says, "Are you Scruggs?" And you say, "Yes." And he says,
You did good, buddy. You did good. And the best thing, buddy, was the names. God bless you for the names, buddy.
It was the names, wasn't it?
wow, what a scene. But it was the names, right? It's the names.
Yeah, that was the whole thing. And all of the designs in the competition had different ways to display the names, and Maya Lin had the most simple and most powerful.
Well, Jan Scruggs, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. I wish you the best. You are one heck of a guy. You are an icon. Jan doesn't like to have all these accolades thrown at him, but he is an icon. When you say the Vietnam War Memorial Wall, the name Jan Scruggs is right there. Jan, thank you for your service. Well, that wraps up another episode of Phuket Stories. If you'd like to participate in a future Phuket Stories podcast, email your contact information to PhuketStories@gmail.com. That's PhuketStories@gmail.com. Until next time, thanks for listening to the Phuket Stories podcast. I'm Saigon Steve.